Hi, I'm Lori Roberts. I'm your host for Historically Speaking, and today's our first show of the new year. And we're starting off our show with, I guess we will make you sick by the time you get through with this show in a good way. But we're going to be talking about the Spanish influenza today, and this story affected a lot of people here in Lawrence County and the surrounding areas and across the globe. So we're going to jump right in. Today's guest is Mary Kinser. Mary Kinser is an RN and a public health nurse with the Public Health Department here in Bedford. Lawrence County. And we're going to have her give us a little bit of info about herself, and then I'm going to go ahead and jump into the show, and we'll go from there.
Okay, I'm a B&L graduate, and I also went to the North Lawrence Career Center, formerly called the Vocational School, and went through the Health Occupations Program. When I got out of school, I went on to become an LPN. I got that at Ivy Tech, and then worked for a period of time at Garden Villa as an LPN, and then went on back to school and did the accelerated program at Vincennes University and got my RN. And I worked as assistant director of nursing and a float nurse at the hospital and did all kinds of various jobs. And then in 1996, I came to the Career Center to teach health science, what it's called today. And I taught what they called back then was health occupations. So I taught Health Science 1, Health Science 2, medical terminology, and I was an adjunct instructor for Ivy Tech. And did the CNA program there and retired there last year, May 2019. Well, I
was going to say both my daughters had you, and
yes.
They loved having your class. And so my oldest daughter was a nurse, and then Annie, my youngest daughter,
yes.
she enjoyed your class a lot as well.
Yes.
So yeah, I know the kids miss having you out.
Well, I still teach. I do a lot of community teaching in my job. I do Narcan training. I have nursing students that come in and spend time in their public health area. And this semester was really interesting because I have an epidemiology student from IU, and she's in her last semester. So she's really helped me research about the Spanish flu. Yeah. So she spends Tuesdays and Wednesdays with me, and that'll be through May that she does that. So.
Well, this was just perfect timing on
our
part.
She knew a lot about the Spanish flu.
Well, so. We are going to go to you for our Sage on Stage. I'm going to show a little bit of a clip here, a picture, and this was probably very common in all the newspapers, and this is our topic. We're going to be talking about the Spanish influenza, and this is during the 1918, so it's going to kind of coincide with the next show that we're going to do on World War I. So those two things are going to come together. So from the fall of 1918 to the spring of 1920, which is tying into the 100 years here, the county was in the grip of an influenza epidemic, and thousands of people were succumbed to that. The flu killed more than 675,000 in the United States. Some reports as high as 20 million worldwide.
I've even saw 100 million.
That's amazing.
Because of no records on it and all that, so could be.
And I'll let you kind of speak to the reasons, and I'll let you handle that. The disease, though, was spread originally here by soldiers at the close of World War I. The main outbreak came here, thought to have started in Fort Riley, Kansas. Is what my notes say. And so why don't you kind of take a shot at telling us what you've. First of all, maybe you can just tell us what a pandemic is.
Okay, a pandemic is different from an epidemic. So an epidemic is where we have a large group of people that have it. A pandemic is where it takes off quickly and it's worldwide, very quickly. So the Spanish flu is one of the worst pandemics in history, and they call it the forgotten flu.
The forgotten flu?
Because people just seem to, after something's gone a while, they tend to forget the seriousness of it. So when we have a pandemic, a lot of times it starts in an animal base, like with a bird flu. A bird or a pig, animal-to-animal contact, spread to another animal, and then spread to a human, and then human to human.
Do you think that's because most of the country was rural at the time?
Could be, and I have saw recently where they even think, I read originally like you about Camp Riley, and that they thought maybe it came there from a pig, from the pigs. But most recently I read an article that says that it may have even started in China. And when the Chinese workers came over during the wartime to work and they came over on trains that were crowded, ships that were crowded, and they think that maybe that started it. They really don't know for sure, but that's just something that they're considering.
Well, one of the things that I read too was this pandemic came to Indiana in waves, and the second wave hit Indiana far worse than the first wave, which was when the men were coming back from the war. And by the time the pandemic had passed, my records showed 150,000 Hoosiers had been affected, but only 10,000 had died. Is that close to what you had?
That's what, yeah.
Okay.
And originally what I found was it started, records were Fort Wayne.
Oh.
And it talked about Indiana having a less of a pandemic than like New York and some other states because of their good infection control practices during that time. So Indianapolis was one of the least cities that was hit with the flu at that time.
Now, did you have anything about Dr. Dollins?
I saw him in some of my notes. We have this amazing book. We have 3 different books at the health department, but this is a book for the city of Bedford.
Okay.
And it's not for the county because the county and the city were totally different in their health departments at that time. And so it lists the causes of death and the year. And you can see epidemics as they occur by that. Saw a lot of typhoid, diphtheria, just different outbreaks, TB, like that. And I did see some familiar doctors' names in there, like Dr. Dollins that I recognize.
Well, I know when I was going, and you talked about the health department, and I'm going to give a shameless plug for the Historical Society. I found 2 really good books in the research library upstairs, and it was just on Bedford, and there was a whole section on the Spanish flu. And it was so interesting. I mean, if you guys have never been to the Historical Society, to the museum down on the square, you are missing a gem. I'm not from Bedford originally, and that was one of the things when I moved here. First place I wanted to go was to the Historical Society. And I spent the whole afternoon going through the museum. I thought, what a treasure that Lawrence County has, and to have things donated from this time period that you can
amazing.
You can see, and it's such a neat place. And in that book, it talked about Dr. Dollins, and of course, as a teacher, all these names, Stalker, Dollins, it's like, oh, okay, so that's where they got these names. But he had prohibited, and which would, back then you think, well, everybody thought, bathing was even kind of sketchy during the winter, but he wanted to prohibit any kind of public gatherings, close the schools, churches, everyone had to take precautions, and by September 8th, they had already ordered that if you passed from influenza, you had to have a private burial.
Right, and only your immediate family is what I found.
Now, did they think that the corpse carried it?
I think they thought that groups of people, if those people were beginning to get influenza, then they would pass it on to others, because you can pass influenza on 4 days prior to your symptoms. And so they may have not appeared to have any symptoms during the time.
Well, I'm going to show a couple of pictures. Did you have anything else you wanted to share on that before I show these, or while I'm showing?
I believe that it was one of the very first things that brought about public health in Lawrence County. Prior to that, it had been the Red Cross that would send in nurses, and nurses were very short in every area of the country because a lot of them had went off to war. And it was also the beginning of the practical nurse, the LPN, during that time. So in my research, I saw that that's when they very first began to have a public health nurse in the city of Bedford and also one out in the county. And they didn't have an office, they were within the school system. So I believe that's the first concept of the school nurse as well. And they did vision screenings and all those things that are still in the schools today, which I found very interesting. And they worked under a health officer just like I do now. Dr. Smith is the health officer for Lawrence County. So that's where it all began. And I just found it so interesting, you know, all the information, because I love historical stuff. So, and they do say, you know, that the Spanish flu hit in waves. And the first wave was lighter. The second wave, because the virus strain mutates and becomes stronger. So it goes around the world and it comes back. And that was the worst strain. And then the third time it comes back, it was a weaker strain.
Well, this I thought was interesting. Now, always when you're, you know, when you're out somewhere and you see people spitting, that always just,
Oh, yeah.
you know, that was one of my pet peeves, are spitters. Sorry, people, if you spit, but that's just one of those things that gross me out. But this, at the time, you know, you had men who would, you know, be spitting on the sidewalks, and so this sign kind of tickled me because it said, no spitting, no spit.
I guess there's still actually a law in the books in Lawrence County dating back to that time. And actually in bigger cities, the Boy Scouts would go around and watch if people spit in the street, and they would give them what they called a ticket against that and say, no public spitting. So people were encouraged to frown on people that spit and coughed out in public. And they actually, in Indianapolis, closed down, and a lot of cities closed down theaters and schools and quit having any kind of public meeting. And in the streetcars in Indianapolis, they said no more than four people could ride in the streetcar at a time, because they felt the more people, the more spreading of the virus. And also, like we were talking about the funerals. And that also said that many of the families had to bury their own dead because there were so many people piled up, and so it just couldn't be taken care of.
And that was something, too, that I noticed, and this goes way back, because we both like the historical, and we both tend to like the same kind of weird things, too. But I love cemeteries.
Oh, me too.
And growing up, both, you know, cemeteries in my hometown, my dad would mow the grave sites, and I'd play, you know, around the headstones. And I remember, just as a little bitty girl, seeing the same years over and over. 1918, 1919. And I remember asking my grandmother when we were there decorating graves, and I can remember saying, Mama, why are there so many, you know, and she said, oh, that was from the influenza, you know, the influenza. And I didn't know what that was, but I knew that we had had family members that had died. But this picture, you know, you talked about the school nurse. And so this is a group of young boys in Indiana who are wearing their mask, which kudos to the health department for passing those out. And then this was the other one, the schools feeding the children their lunch, and of course everybody's got their mask on. In September, the mayor had ordered a sign placed on everybody's residence. If you were sick, you had to have your note or your sign on the outside of your door signaling, you know, there was sickness inside.
Yeah, that was the first quarantine type thing in Lawrence County, where they had actual cards on people's
I looked
homes.
for that when I was at the health or at the Historical Society. They may have one, but I was kind of pressed for time.
Yeah.
But they said, you know, topics of conversation at restaurants and whatnot, because now people couldn't really go out and eat. You know, they were at boarding houses or whatever, and the common phrase was "down with the flu," and you know that was the typical. So while I'm showing some of these, do you want to kind of give us some information about maybe the onset and what to expect? If you were down with the flu, how long would it take?
Typically, it's an onset of 4 days after being exposed to it. And what I found interesting is I looked at, could the Spanish flu happen again? And yes, it could. because we've got a whole new generation of people, and more people don't take the flu shot. That's
That's
kind
what
of
this
controversial. But this year we have given a lot of flu vaccine at the health department. That if we don't learn from history, then we're going to repeat it,
Exactly.
as we know. So I would encourage everybody. It's still flu season. We've had flu in the schools. We've had a lot of flu this year. We started out with flu A, it went to flu B, and now it's kind of back and forth this year. So I would encourage anybody that hadn't had a flu shot to get the flu shot, if you can do that.
In the picture that I just held up, that was where they were immunizing the children. Even in, the schools did it. Churches would have people come and give you immunizations for that. But it wasn't just the flu, because the flu, according to what I read, kind of segued onto other things you could get.
Originally they didn't have vaccines at the time, but they did come up with two what they called vaccinations that were strep pneumoniae, which is now a Hib, and that's what they were giving. So they were not effective, but it was like the first thought of vaccine back in that time. So the flu shot actually came about in the 30s. In the early 40s, they gave it to World War II soldiers and then to the general public.
Okay. So a lot of those deaths, I read in the book down there at the museum that it was, like you said, pneumonia, but it also, there were scarlet fever deaths.
A lot of scarlet fever, and scarlatina is the same thing, and I saw that. A lot of typhoid fever, TB, all different things that I saw.
Age-wise, I notice a lot of the very young.
Yeah, it was from 20 to 40 because they didn't have immunity build up, they thought. And it was people that were generally healthy people, and it affected their immune system greatly. So they would, they might be well at breakfast time, and by lunchtime started to feel bad, and by dinner would have a lot of respiratory issues. Their skin would turn such a color blue that what I read said sometimes you really couldn't even tell the color of their skin. And they would cough, they would get pneumonia with it, and they would have blood, they would cough that blood and have blood come out from their nasal cavity as well.
So not a very pleasant disease to be witness to. It says in my notes that caused a record total of 46 burials in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So like you said, if you don't have a coroner or funeral directors to come, you're pretty much taking, and a lot of people buried at home.
Yes.
They had plots at home.
Yes.
And so the statistics I have, death in the county were about 4 a day from
very
Spanish
sad.
flu. The schools were ordered to be closed in Lawrence County, especially in Bedford, on October 25th. And this tickled me. Dr. Voiles ordered no burning of leaves because he thought smoke spread germs.
Well, and it talks about what they told people was plenty of rest, plenty of fresh air, so open window, abundant food.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
And they referred to the toning of the body, keeping your body toned and fit. And it talked about just general things that we still think about today, when we think about rest and relaxation and how to fight off a virus. So it is very interesting.
Yeah, and just the manner of medicines that you see in the old magazines, the tonics and, what they were taking to ward off things, and really just good old-fashioned hand washing and things.
Right.
Probably. One of the things that I read, and it was really interesting, by the middle of October, this pandemic had spread to where 82,000 people in America had died. And someone had pointed out, by this time, it was twice the number of men killed in the war.
Yeah, isn't that sad? Yes.
And you would think they would have died of diseases over there.
Yeah.
more so than here.
Maybe because they were injured and they came home, they were in crowded ships and trains and things like that. I
Compromised.
watched that movie a couple weeks ago, 1917,
Yes.
and just to look at the trenches and how that was. And it made me think, both of my grandfathers were in World War I, made it home.
Wow.
Didn't have might have had the flu, but lived through the flu, and how amazing that is.
It
you
is.
know, that they were able to do that.
It's very. This picture shows just the level of precaution that the nurses, like yourself, would have been. Now, some of them I've seen where they just have, the uniform and a mask, but this lady's like in a hazmat. She's taking
She's
no
hazmat
chances.
before it was popular, and
Yeah, and this is another one. This is IU, actually. They turned the, I can't think what the hall, anyway.
one of the halls there.
They turned this hall into a makeshift hospital.
Yeah. The hospitals were so full they couldn't take any more flu, so they used schools and they used private residences and all different kind of places.
It's amazing.
Now, they called it the Spanish flu, not because Spain had the most flu, but because during that time, Spain was neutral in the war. And both sides of the war did not want the publicity of illness, so they did not speak about it on the news. There was a blackout. But Spain went ahead and talked about their flu, the flu there. And also their King Alfonso was known that he had the flu. So they call it the Spanish flu because they're the first ones that spoke about the flu.
I did not know that. That is interesting. I tried to pull out cases here in town that maybe some of the viewers are related to these people. One story really kind of tugged at my heartstring. It was a man by the name of Leland Yaney. He was 18. His friend was Jasper Pace, and there's Paces, still here in Bedford. And he wanted to go check on his friend. And so he arrived to find not only was Jasper ill, but his whole family was down with the flu. So being the good friend that he was, he decided instead of going home, he would just stay put and take care of Jasper and his family. And while he was there, he contracted the flu, and within 2 days had died himself. And the whole family, I guess, had passed. So that was sad. By the spring, there was actually 50 new cases in Bedford, 60 in Tunnelton, little old Tunnelton, 120 in Williams. And that seems to be that second peak, the wave. And then here's another photograph. And then you can see in the background there is a soldier. He's right there. And so you had soldiers, you had civilians, the soldiers that were coming home and contracted the illness. And probably this didn't do a lot for keeping the numbers down because they're all just out in a big open room like that. But it was weird because the flu started with no rhyme or reason, and it went away with no rhyme or reason. Did you have anything as far as how, as far as when you got the flu and you had all those symptoms, were you also in a state where you were maybe in a coma?
I didn't really find coma, but I don't know if they defined it at that time, maybe. They talked about him, gasping for air and turning blue. So, I would say that would be so, but didn't really find anything that stated that.
Well, I read something, and it wasn't in Lawrence County information, but it was a while back when I was doing research for a different topic, and I read where at this time period when someone passed, embalming still wasn't really for everybody.
Right.
They couldn't afford it.
Right.
And so a lot of homes would have a neighbor come and keep the body washed. Okay. Well, when there was the influenza, a lot of people were afraid to come do that, to sit with the body. And there was a story in something that I read that they thought this person had passed. and someone had sat with that body, and they were getting ready to have the wake. And the body sat up, and I guess had passed through the most critical part of the flu, and sat up and scared that poor person that was sitting with them to death.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so then they started making the time that they put the people in the ground. I think they gave it an extra day because they were so afraid that the heart rate slowed down so much that they wouldn't be
Is
able.
that when they would put the bell in the casket?
That was Victorian.
Okay.
That was
Okay.
Victorian, but this was, you know, from this time period, and I guess maybe it happened, and that's,
Yes.
you know, the sad
Yes.
thing of that. One thing too I found that tickled me, and I know where I come from, basketball was, you know, even during the blizzard, everybody was worried, well, how are we going to make up all these basketball games, you
Right.
know, back in the day. And so regardless, during this time, the flu was still ravaging people out in March of, I guess, early 2020. And so the concern there wasn't bad enough because they played the game. They had the
Right.
sectional.
Right.
So die
Of course.
hard, you know.
Of course.
Yeah,
Yes.
die, just put your
Maybe
mask
that's
on.
where that term came from.
It could have been.
Yeah.
Yeah, just put your mask on. We're going.
Yes.
So.
I did read a lot about Fort Benjamin Harrison too.
Okay.
And how Indianapolis, the downtown Indy is 9 miles from there. They had redone the road to there a little bit prior and built what they wanted to consider a hospital for the wounded soldiers that came back from the war from Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois.
Okay.
They started coming back, and when they came back, they were ill with the flu. And so quickly that spread. And it's the first case that I saw was a cook.
I'll be darned.
You know, how quickly that can
Yeah.
spread. So it mentioned that at first some of the people just wanted to let on like it wasn't severe and it wasn't the flu, but they finally had to go ahead and say that. So they were a big spot for soldiers in recovery during that time.
So they would send them home if they were getting ill to Fort
Right, to a
Benjamin Harrison.
closer place for their
Okay,
family
gotcha.
and that. So, and it talked about they didn't have medical personnel and that people were dying because they didn't have nurses, you know. So a lot of these makeshift hospitals, they use medical students or whoever they could find. And then the issue became that these people got the flu and they were dying and they had nobody to take care of people at that time.
Wow. And wonder too, I know the poorhouses in and around Bedford in Orange County down south of here. I wondered when I was doing my research, and I didn't find anything about the poor farm, and I wondered how many people got medical attention. You know, the least.
I found it mentioned.
Okay. Well, in the health department things?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And they talked about being different places to go. But mainly they talked about TB within
Okay.
the poor farm, as they called it.
Well, to me, with the flu being so bad right now, it just worked out that this was kind of the show that I was going to be
Absolutely.
working on, you know, for this time. And of course, it kind of parallels with our next show that we're going to do, and that's going to be on World War I. So,
Wonderful.
yeah, there's a lot of information I found down at the museum on Lawrence County and World War I. But is there anything else that you would like to tell us?
I did want to mention at the health department that we take most insurances for all kinds of vaccines. And if people cannot afford, if they don't have health insurance, we provide what we call 317 state-funded insurance or state-funded vaccine. And we charge $15 a shot for that, or if someone can't pay that, we waive that fee. We also come into the schools and provide vaccine clinics. We started last year here at BNL with our first one. We went to Mitchell for several years. We do several clinics at Mitchell. We do a lot of flu clinics. And also we have what we call VFC, vaccines for children.
Okay.
And so children that are uninsured or underinsured can come into the health department and get those vaccines at no charge or minimum charge of $15 each. If they can't pay that, then we waive that fee.
So do you see a lot of kids coming in, getting their shots to
Yes.
come back to school?
Absolutely. We've
Yeah.
had a lot in. We've had really since our Hep A outbreak.
Yes.
It has really increased the knowledge of the health department in Lawrence County. And, you know, it was like we had a pod in there every day for emergency preparedness. When I first started there,
Yeah.
it was the beginning of it. And people would come in and they saw, hey, I can get this, and I can also get this, and I can get this. And our shots are always given by an RN. We don't charge an extra fee. You know, it's the cheapest place that you can go because we're
Exactly.
nonprofit. And they see that they can get in and out, and it's professional service. So we have really, really built up our vaccines. It's amazing the amount of vaccines that we do at the health department. We do all types. We do flu, pneumonia, Shingrix even we give. We do. And we're continuing to give a lot of Hep A vaccines as well. So this year we offered 3 different types of flu vaccine at the health department.
Okay.
We offered the regular flu vaccine. We offered one called the flu block that's made, it's not made with egg products, so people that are allergic to eggs like me could take that. And also a lot of patients on chemo and immunosuppression, sometimes the doctors will recommend that particular flu vaccine. And usually we're about the only place in the county that does carry that. And then we also carry one called high-dose flu. And that is the flu shot that's recommended for those 65 and older. So it's geared for their age. So we recommend flu for anybody yearly from 6 months of age on up.
So like for the little guys, do they give them a nose?
We don't do the nasal
You don't do
anymore. Yeah.
Okay.
Their first flu shot, we give them one, and then a few months later we give them a second one. Once we do that, then it's yearly.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a good resource to have, especially, you know, if you're a parent of more than one child and you get sick, that's an expense of going to the doctor and paying.
And a lot of people don't know it. You know, I try to put all this on our Facebook. I go on WBIW and talk about it, but it's expensive, you know.
Yeah.
It's expensive to go to the doctor and get vaccines if they don't. A lot of the physicians do the vaccine for children as well.
So at the end of the program, we'll put up your, do you have the information for the health department as well?
Sure,
that
I
we
can.
can add, and
Sure.
that way people who are interested in taking advantage of the shots, which I highly suggest if you have more than one child, or if, you know, your insurance isn't as good and you want to do that, that would be awesome. So we'll get that at the end of the program.
All right. One thing I did want to mention is the health department does the disease investigations for the county, any kind of contagious disease. And when I look back on it, this actually started during this time where the county health nurse and the city health nurse were investigating disease. And I still do that to this day. Every kind of hepatitis case that comes in, A, B, or C, any kind of infectious disease, I do an investigation on that. And one thing that I'm very proud that we also provide is for people that are hepatitis C positive, that have Hep C, we provide free vaccination of Hep A and Hep B vaccines to them to help protect them from those.
Wow. So did you have to get some kind of training from the CDC to do that? Or do it just
I'm constantly getting trained.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's ongoing.
We have a district. Our district is District 8, and it encompasses Lawrence, Orange, Monroe, Brown, Bartholomew, those counties.
Okay.
And so each county has what we call an epidemiologist for the county, and ours is Jill Stauffer. And so her and I work really closely on disease investigation. I work really closely with all the different epidemiology specialties at the health department. And also we do a lot of emergency management at the health department. And we started doing that during the period of time of World War I.
Okay.
So,
well, that's interesting. Well, I'm sure I'll come as we're getting ready to do the next show, I'll probably come across some of your information that you've cited from the health department when I start doing the World War I. Well, thank you
Thank you so much,
You are
Lori.
so gracious to come on. And
Thank you. I've
do
enjoyed
this.
it.
Oh, I have too. We get to catch up and haven't
Yes.
seen you for a long time. So I
Yes.
appreciate you being willing to come in and do all the research that you did. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So this wraps up our program on the Spanish influenza, the pandemic that circled the globe from 1918 to 1920. So 100 years ago that's been. So our next show, like I said, we're going to be talking about World War I. And we're going to look at Lawrence County soldiers and bring some of those to light and speak to some of maybe your ancestors. So thank you so much for watching. This has been Historically Speaking, and I'm your host, Lori Roberts, and today's guest has been Mary Kinser. Thank you for watching.